Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening, and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. Last month in Florida, President Donald Trump sounded a warning about lax immigration policies.
We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening in Germany. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
The media immediately said he thought there had been a terrorist attack in Sweden the night before, and there wasn't. They jumped all over it. The president later explained on Twitter, "My statement as to what happened in Sweden was in reference to a story that was broadcast on Fox News concerning immigrants and Sweden." He was referring to a Tucker Carlson interview of Amy Horowitz, a documentary filmmaker. Horowitz discussed an absolute surge in gun violence and rape in Sweden once it began its open door policy. The mainstream media then criticized Carlson and his guests for misrepresenting the situation in Sweden. They apparently forgot that only 1 year ago, Sweden was already in a crisis. In fact, Norway's Prime Minister openly spoke of actions she would take if Sweden collapsed. The media told us that the crime rate in Sweden is down, especially in rape. Many quoted Sweden's integration minister, Ylva Johansson, who said, "We can see that the level is going down and going down and going down." From 2014 to 2015, there was a small drop in the number of sex crimes, but a 1 year decrease is not the same as going down and going down and going down. She later corrected herself. "I based my answer on information that I had at the time that the number of reports of rapes went down in 2015. It was wrong of me to speak of a development that was only based on 1 year." The preliminary figures for 2016, unfortunately, show that the figures are on the rise. Year-to-year statistics are not what's important here. We need to look at overall trends. Sweden began bringing in large numbers of Muslims in 1975. Since then, violent crime has risen 300%. Rape increased 1,472%, from 421 rapes in 1975 to 6,620 in 2014. In the entire world, only one small country of 2 million people has a higher per capita incidence of rape than Sweden. Tucker Carlson summarized the situation. 50 years of immigration policy is coming to flower in Europe. We're not paying any attention. We're not drawing any of the obvious lessons from it. It's not working. That's the real point here. In the Wall Street Journal, prominent Swedish politicians Jimmy Åkesson and Matthias Carlson wrote, "Mr. Trump did not exaggerate Sweden's current problems. If anything, he understated them. Sweden's Civil Contingencies Agency, known as the MSB, is an official arm of the Swedish Ministry of Defense. The MSB recently released a report stating that the Muslim Brotherhood is building a parallel society in Sweden. The Muslim Brotherhood is a violent extremist group. From it came both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Muslim Brotherhood assassinated Anwar Sadat. The MSB report says that Brotherhood affiliates are infiltrating the Swedish government, political parties, academic institutions, NGOs, and other organizations. On this program, I've described so-called no-go zones in France and the United Kingdom. These are areas that police refuse to patrol regularly and will only enter in force. There are credible reports now of similar zones in Sweden. As in most of Europe, the Muslims of Sweden are not being assimilated into society. Muslim communities across the continent are creating parallel justice systems based on Sharia law. In the UK, some Sharia courts are government sanctioned, but across Europe, most operate on their own. Either way, they're as likely to punish the victim of rape as they are to punish the rapist. The Muslim Brotherhood is also active in the United States, and they've had some stunning successes. Associates of the Brotherhood have infiltrated the highest levels of the U.S. government. In 2007, the Justice Department accused the Holy Land Foundation, a Muslim charity, of funneling money to terrorists. They named the Council on American Islamic Relations. CAIR is an unindicted co-conspirator. CAIR is connected to both Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Religion of Peace website reports CAIR has solicited money from sponsors of terror and received financial support from convicted terrorists. CAIR founders have praised terrorists to Muslim audiences and said that suicide bombers are acting on behalf of Islam. CAIR board members have called for the overthrow of the United States and the imposition of Islamic law. CAIR has suggested applying Sharia punishment, i.e. the death penalty, to users who criticize Islam on the internet. Despite all this, the Obama administration employed members of CAIR as its main advisors on anything pertaining to Islam. Agents of the Muslim Brotherhood recently came within a hair breadth of the highest echelon of U.S. power. But for a small number of votes in certain key states, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton would now be president. Her closest associate, Huma Abedin, has clear ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Abedin's mother served as editor-in-chief at the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. That is a Sharia law journal based in London. According to Jihad Watch, the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs contains repeated and approving citations to prominent Muslim Brotherhood thinkers. The goal of the magazine is to help Muslims to not assimilate in Western cultures. Writing for The Hill, investigative reporter Kenneth Timmerman said, a Saudi government document inspired by Ms. Abedin's father explained the concept of Muslim minority affairs, the title the journal Mr. Abedin founded, and its goal to establish a global Sharia in our modern times. While working as an intern in the Clinton White House, Abedin wrote articles for the journal. In 1995, she became associate editor of the journal. On the masthead, she kept that title until 2008. In the year 2000, she became Hillary Clinton's primary aide and personal advisor. She remained in that role with various titles at least until the end of the last year's presidential campaign. Notice the overlap. Abedin worked for a Sharia law journal while her boss was a U.S. senator and a leading presidential candidate. She left her role as an assistant editor not long before Hillary became Secretary of State. Timmerman concluded, the evidence, in my opinion, is overwhelming. Huma Abedin is nothing short of a Muslim Brotherhood princess born into an illustrious family of Brotherhood leaders. Aberdeen worked for 13 years as part of an enterprise whose explicit goal was to conquer the West in the name of Islam. This woman came within a whisker of becoming the closest confidant of the President of the United States. I told you last week how Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to Congress, came within a few votes of becoming the leader of the Democratic Party. Aberdeen and Ellison are not just Muslims. They both have ties to radical Islamic groups. They failed to reach the positions they had hoped for, but the danger is not past. Ellison will probably be the next leader of the Democrats, and political correctness will continue to protect and promote Islam in our highest halls of government. The European Union is in big trouble. On March 1st, Forbes ran an article with the headline, "An Investor's Guide to the Collapse of the European Union." Writer Stephen McBride observed, "Greece's fiscal follies have surfaced once again, but that's not the EU's biggest threat at the moment." That award goes to Italy's banks. Currently, around 18% of Italian bank loans are non-performing. To put that into perspective, he pointed out that even at the height of 2008 financial crisis, only 7% of U.S. bank loans were non-performing. He concluded 2017 could be the year the EU collapses under its own weight. For some reason, the Europeans have decided that the middle of this crisis would be a good time to pick a fight with President Trump and the United States. The New York Times said, the European Parliament has passed a non-binding resolution calling for the reintroduction of visa requirements for American citizens. That means that American tourists to Europe will need to obtain a visa for each country they visit. Currently, Americans can travel without visas throughout the EU. The added red tape will discourage many Americans from traveling to Europe for pleasure. Supposedly, the move is in retaliation for something done by the Obama administration. The U.S. has a visa waiver program in place for most of the EU, but not for Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Poland, or Romania. Citizens of those countries must have visas to travel to the U.S. The EU has long complained about this, but never did anything about it until now. In the midst of what might be an existential crisis, Europe has decided to suddenly play hardball with the U.S. on the minor issues. At least that's how the story is being sold. But it's hard to believe for several reasons. Primarily, this is a poor way to approach President Trump. He clearly responds better to negotiations than to threats. So why the get tough policy before they've even had a chance to negotiate with the new administration? I don't think it has anything to do with the 5 nations whose citizens need visas to travel to the United States. I think it's another way of expressing their disdain for Donald Trump. The Wall Street Journal suggested something similar, saying that the vote reflects the hostility among some European politicians to the Trump administration. It's unlikely that U.S. citizens will need visas to visit Europe anytime soon. Imagine cash-poor Italy, Greece, or Spain being deprived of U.S. tourist dollars. Europe has 4 bigger problems. Geopolitical forecaster George Friedman explains, the EU is merely a treaty between nations, not a federation. As such, there is nothing holding it together except the promise of prosperity. When that prosperity is no longer forthcoming, people will leave. A white paper recently released by European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker suggests 5 possible directions for the EU to go. Number 1, follow the current course. But that's not working. Number 2, become nothing more than a free trade organization. But that would mean reducing regulations. And Europeans see that as lowering of standards. Number 3, the EU could become a trade organization where smaller groups of countries could get together on certain issues. But the trade group with several smaller entities would not work as a counterbalance to the power of the United States and Asia. Number 4, become leaner and more efficient. But that too would mean a reduction in regulations and perhaps even a lowering of human rights standards. Number 5, doing much more together. It means becoming more than a group held together by treaty. It means becoming a United States of Europe with power centered in Brussels and a vast military to back them up. This is the one preferred by the global elites, and according to the Bible, it's the one they will eventually choose. Right now, an air of desperation surrounds the EU. They hate Trump because he represents a rising force of nationalism that threatens to tear them apart. Friedman says the only thing holding them together is the promise of prosperity. But they want to create the world's leading nation. They want a powerful military and a federal government of Europe. To help them achieve these goals, I think they have an unexpected ally, Vladimir Putin. The one thing besides prosperity that can hold the EU together is a common enemy. That enemy needs to be truly frightening, and Putin might be just the thing. Let's look again at Sweden. With all the coverage of President Trump's statement, did you hear anyone mention that Sweden is in the midst of preparing for war with Russia? They are. Sweden's Civil Contingency Agency recently sent a letter to Sweden's municipal authorities. It told them, prepare for war. The letter spoke of worsening international situation and increased uncertainty in the immediate area. After 200 years of peace, the whole country is gearing up for battle. Sweden is in the process of restating its military draft. They have stepped up cross-border military exercises with Finland. One Swedish defense official said, the security situation in our region has deteriorated and we must prepare ourselves in terms of war and of conflict. At the very least, this means returning to a Cold War footing. The Prime Minister said Russian aggression and destabilization of Ukraine pose the most serious challenge to the European security order since the end of the Cold War. U.S. News and World Report said, Russia is quietly testing the defense of the Nordic neighbors with subtle provocations alarming Western powers concerned about Moscow's intentions in a vital but largely overlooked part of the world. In recent months, Russian fighter jets violated the airspace of Western nations. Moscow has turned a blind eye as thousands of refugees from countries along its southern border use Russian territory to cross into Europe. And the former superpower has deployed missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads to areas that pose a direct threat to NATO countries. All this is leading to the Antichrist. Several times on past programs, I've talked about the prophecy of Daniel's 70th week. I'm going to give you an extremely simplified version of that prophecy right now. Daniel chapter 9 talks about a period of 490 years divided into three parts. The prophecy gives a specific starting and ending point for each of the time periods. The first two add up to 483 years. Those years have come and gone. The prophecy perfectly foretold what would happen to Israel during those years. The prophecy also made it clear that there would be a gap of time between the first 483 years and the last segment of 7 years. We know there's a gap because the scripture tells us that after the 483 years, but before the last 7 years, certain things would happen. First, the Messiah would be cut off. That refers to the crucifixion of Jesus. Next, Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. That refers to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 A.D. Even though those two events have come and gone, we are still living in the gap. The Bible doesn't say how long it lasts. Almost hidden in this Bible passage is the national identity for the Antichrist. It calls him the prince who is to come, and it says the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. We know from history who did those things. It was the Romans. That means the Romans are the people of the prince who is to come. That means the Antichrist will be part of a revived Roman Empire. For years, prophecy teachers have taken this passage and others to mean that there would one day be some kind of a European confederacy, and the people laughed. They said, the Europeans have always hated each other. There's no way to get them together. That seemed to be confirmed by World War I and II. Then came the common market, which turned into the European Union. Suddenly, it all seemed possible. Now the critics point to the fact that Europe seems to be falling apart once again. Also, in its current form, the EU is much too weak. It can't provide the kind of power base the Antichrist will need. As of now, they don't even have an army. The Antichrist will need a radically centralized power structure and an expansive military. At the moment, a wave of nationalism is dividing Europeans. The Germans are tired of subsidizing the Greeks and the Italians. Britain broke away completely. Several other nations are threatening to leave. Under these circumstances, what could motivate Europe to pull together into one big federal government? What would make them want a world-class military? To me, the answer is obvious. Vladimir Putin's Russia. He invaded Ukraine. He stole Crimea. He harasses their ships and planes, and he sponsors border skirmishes. He threatens war. As we speak, the nations of Europe are scrambling to find a way to deal with the growing menace from Moscow. I believe Russia could be the catalyst for pushing the weak European Union into becoming the powerful confederacy of nations led by the Antichrist in the last days. It seems that daily there are new developments, so we should keep our eyes on Russia and expect Europe to move soon to protect itself. That means we must also keep looking up, folks. The Lord could come back to rescue his people out of the world at any moment. Are you ready to go? All you have to do to be ready is to admit that you are a sinner and can never measure up to God's standards for your life. Believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he gave his life to pay the penalty you owe for your sins. Then accept the free gift of pardon he purchased for you on Calvary. If you do that, If you pray that prayer and meant it, then you will immediately join God's forever family. And you can look forward to an eternity of happiness in the presence of God Himself. Do it now. Well, that's it for tonight, folks. God willing, I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.